This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian and certified intuitive eating counselor, offering online courses and programs to help people all over the world make peace with food. Join me here every week as I talk with interesting people from all walks of life about their relationships with food and their bodies.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, welcome to episode 194 of Food Psych. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fellow anti-diet dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and journalist, Carrie Dennett. We discuss her experiences with quote-unquote successful dieting and being part of the National Weight Control Registry, why she ultimately stopped dieting and embraced health at every size, the many problems with the National Weight Control Registry, why the vast majority of intentional weight loss efforts, aka diets, fail, how weight stigma affects people of all sizes, and so much more. It's a really great episode, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, I'll answer this week's listener question. And just a heads up on this one that there's some fat-phobic language and beliefs in the question itself. So if you think that might be triggering for you, then you can skip ahead about a minute to my answer, where I'll be pushing back against those beliefs. It's from a listener named Lou who writes, I'm with another food coach and your work was mentioned in our Facebook group. I'm listening to your podcast and love all the body positivity and non-diet messages. What I cannot yet find is an assurance that weight loss is possible even if not guaranteed. I understand that it shouldn't be the main goal and diets cause rebound binging. Funny, as a consumer, I want a trainer or food coach that is within the range of quote-unquote normal body size, just like you'd want a financial advisor who seems to manage his own money reasonably well. But it's not fair if the food coach who has figured out how to be at a comfortable weight won't assure the client that it is possible. I'm hearing acceptance at every size, and I agree, but I am uncomfortable at this size. And yes, I'm at the rebound stage gaining weight. I just gotta know weight loss is likely once I'm further along on my journey. Do you have a suggested podcast for me to listen to? Thank you. So thanks, Lou, for that really important question. And before I answer, just my standard disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So I totally get why you would want the assurance that weight loss is likely for you, and that's really because of diet culture. It's because diet culture has conditioned us all to want that. And it's really hard to be in this culture in a larger body, and I'm sure that you want the acceptance and access and respect and all of the things that diet culture tells us are reserved for people in smaller bodies. So I very much empathize with you. I have a lot of compassion for that. But actually that stuff that diet culture has conditioned us to believe is really size-based discrimination, and it's not okay. So diet culture tells us that weight is within our personal control, but the reality is that it's not. We just don't have any way to make larger bodies smaller over the long term. Even if short-term weight loss is possible, long-term weight loss really is not. And that's because of size diversity, which is the fact that bodies naturally come in all different shapes and sizes across the weight spectrum, just like they naturally come in all different heights and skin colors and hair colors and all of the rest of human attributes that are so diverse and that make this world so cool, really. And we have decades of research showing that people's bodies fight against intentional weight loss at every turn, 95% or more of the time. And you'll hear Carrie and me discuss that research in more depth later in the episode. And that low single-digit percentage of people who do manage to lose weight and keep it off generally do so by having food and weight-related thoughts and behaviors take over their life to the point where these quote-unquote successful weight loss maintainers have been compared in the scientific literature to people with chronic anorexia nervosa. And in fact, they may just be people with higher weight anorexia where they started out in larger bodies. And so, they dieted themselves down to the quote unquote normal BMI category. And so society considers their disordered behavior quote unquote healthy instead of disordered, which it actually is. So you'll hear Carrie and me talk a lot more about that later in the episode episode as well about the problems with quote unquote successful weight loss maintenance and what it actually does to people's minds and bodies and mental and physical health and well-being. And so when it comes to your implication that I myself have somehow, quote unquote, figured out how to be the size that I am, that's really not how it works, because bodies don't work like that. I didn't figure anything out because body size really isn't within our conscious control. This is just how my body is without any effort or intention. And really, before I ever dieted or gave any thought to what I ate at all, I was the same general size and shape. And in my most restrictive and disordered eating days 10 to 15 years ago, I was also this same general size and shape, albeit sicker from all the disordered behaviors I was engaging in. So nothing I've ever done has really made a difference in my overall body type. Even if I had small shifts in weight from dieting or not dieting, it didn't make a huge amount of difference. And of course, these days I'm not dieting at all, and I'm back to eating intuitively, just like we were all born doing. And this is still my same general body size and shape. So that's not to say that my weight won't increase or my shape won't change with potential life changes I'll go through, like pregnancy or medication changes or illness and disease, and of course, just general aging, which happens to all of us, right? But my body being the size that it is right now isn't because I've figured out, quote unquote, how to make it that way. It's just how it happens to be. And I know that there's unearned privilege in that at this point in history, when our society really treats people in smaller bodies better than it does people in larger bodies, where those of us in smaller bodies can shop in mainstream clothing stores and fit into seats in public spaces and, just walk down the street without getting called horrible names just for daring to leave the house in a larger body, which happens all the time to folks in larger bodies. And that disparity is absolutely unjust and unacceptable. It's really a form of social injustice. And that's why I'm fighting to change it, and why so many people alongside me are fighting to change it, so that people in larger bodies can have the basic respect and the basic dignity and access that people like me already get just by virtue of living in a smaller body. And it's not fair and it's not right that everyone doesn't already have access to those things despite, whatever their body size. And so I and my fellow activists of all sizes in this movement, including people in the very largest bodies, are working to change that. So when it comes to assuring you that weight loss is likely for you, I just can't do that because no one can. And really anyone who does is just trying to sell you a diet. So some people may lose weight through intuitive eating because that's what their bodies were meant to do. That's what their bodies wanted. But others gain weight through intuitive eating because that's what they need in order to heal from restriction and deprivation. And others stay generally in the same size range. And really all of those things are possibilities no matter what size you started out at. So many folks in larger bodies will gain weight or stay roughly the same size with intuitive eating and with recovery from diet culture because that's what their bodies wanted to do. Because again, size diversity is a real thing, and we're not all meant to be smaller bodied. We're all meant to have different sizes and shapes, and that is a beautiful thing. Our society just needs to learn to see it that way. So what we really need to do as a society is to make it safe and okay to be whatever size your body wants to be, and to help people get the respect and the human rights that they deserve so that they can stop feeling compelled to shrink their bodies or try to shrink their bodies because they can't really do it long term anyway, but stop feeling compelled to try so that they can get back to all of the other things in life that are so much more important. Because as I'm always saying on this podcast, diet culture is a life thief. It steals our time, it steals our money, it steals our well-being, it steals our happiness and joy, and it doesn't give us anything really in return for those things. There might be a temporary reduction in weight stigma that you might experience, but the long-term negatives really outweigh those short-term positives. And it's not our individual responsibility to shrink or change our bodies to fit the cultural norm anyway. It's really society's responsibility to stop being so discriminatory, to stop having this cultural norm that excludes people whose bodies naturally fall at the larger end of the weight spectrum. And we know that bodies, again, come in all diverse sizes and shapes. So of course, bodies will always fall at the larger end of the weight spectrum, and we need to make room for that. We need to make society more inclusive so that it really does include people in larger bodies and give them the same basic human rights that we all want and that we all really deserve. So I hope that helps. And if you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me your question, any question you want really, and have me answer it a lot more quickly than I can do here, you can come join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a whole wealth of audio and written content that teaches you the principles of intuitive eating and really works through and troubleshoots them. And you get access to an exclusive monthly Q&A podcast where you can ask me your own questions and listen to hundreds of answers that I've already given to other people so that you can work through all kinds of different sticking points in intuitive eating and put it into practice in your own life in a way that's going to work. When you join, you'll also get access to our private Facebook group, which is exclusively for course participants, so that you can have real-time guidance from me and my team, as well as hundreds of other great people who are with you on this intuitive eating path. A participant named Kareen recently wrote to me and said, I enrolled in the Intuitive Eating Fundamentals course and it is fabulous and so helpful. I've been able to stop obsessing about food. The freedom is incredible. I feel such a debt of gratitude to you for what you're doing. I knew I was spending too much time and energy focusing on food and exercise and worrying about my body, but I had no idea how much of my life it was sucking away until I was on the other side. And I can never go back. My life has opened up and I have the headspace to pursue things I never imagined. I love getting feedback like that about the course, and now is a really great time to join because I'm getting ready to release a big update to the course materials since I've been teaching this course for 3 years now. And I'm actually going to be closing enrollment for the course for the first time in those 3 years too, which is just wild. And that'll be happening in just a few weeks. So if you join now, you'll get instant access to all the content that people are already loving. Plus, you'll get all the new updates for free as soon as they're released. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And now, without any further ado, let's go talk to Carrie Dennett. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
My relationship with food, I would say it's kind of a mixed bag. There was really a lot of good, which I think I'll start with, but there was also a lot of not so good. On the good part, I was born in California, and until I was about 10, we lived in the Napa and Sonoma Valley areas, which are lovely. And so I just have these beautiful memories of eating things like artichokes and abalone that just, maybe a lot of kids growing up in the 70s in America didn't necessarily have. And my father's stepfather, so my step-grandfather, was Italian. So I was exposed to, really authentic Italian food that, again, my friends weren't eating. In some parts of the country, I'm sure authentic Italian food, that was usual. It wasn't for me. My mom was a good cook, and she, we ate fast food sometimes. We went out sometimes, but she cooked for us most of the time. And I think that really helped me as I became a full-fledged adult and was on my own, just realizing that cooking at home was normal and it didn't have to be difficult. So I think, in terms of nourishing myself, that was a good lesson. And she and my grandmother had vegetable gardens and I just loved them. And, so I kind of took that on as a hobby. So lots of good stuff.
That's nice.
Yeah. So, I always think life throws us good things and not so good things, and it's good to remember both. But unfortunately, my mom had her own history of chronic dieting, starting when she was probably in her teens. I remember her telling me just about some, really crazy diets she did that were, not like today where it's lifestyle changes and wellness. It was just like, no, it was like crash dieting. And even though she never tried to push me to diet, I just really was immersed in diet culture from a very young age. Like that's a normal thing to do. It's normal to try to control your body, even if it's in a way that seems really just out there. And, I was always pretty aware when she was doing things herself to try to diet. Even though she didn't rope us kids in, it was pretty clear, like, oh, mom's not happy with her body right now. She's trying to change it.
Kids really pick up on that. You don't have to be actively pressured yourself to lose weight as a kid to notice the weight loss attempts in adults going on around you.
Oh, totally. And I think about that all the time when people with their own kids think certain things they say don't matter. It's like, wow. I know the things that I picked up on, the subtext I was able to read into, and I was a pretty perceptive kid. And I think probably most kids are. So my mom's dieting history kind of contributed to my eventual dieting history, but she didn't really push me. But the person in my family who was more controlling, my father, he was very controlling about food, and he had very definite ideas about what an appropriate body size looked like. And he was very open with those opinions. I remember, gosh, I was probably like third grade. We lived in California still. And I remember there was a brief stint where my mom tried to take me jogging with her. And I'm sure this was not her idea. I'm sure it was my dad's idea. And I just remember just a horrible, the hot midday California sun. And I'm being forced to jog. And I remember having a stitch in my side. So, like, did we go right after lunch? I don't know. I think it didn't go on for too long, but it's just, and I think that was one of those pivotal moments that it kind of turned me off against physical activity. Like, exercise is this horrible thing, which, it doesn't have to be. I mean, there's many types of physical activity, and I still don't like jogging, but, walking, yoga, things I love. But it just, it's just one of those childhood impressions that did not serve me well at the time. And it really worked against me probably for years to come.
Yeah, because it made physical activity seem like a punishment or something you had to do to earn your food or work off food or whatever, rather than just like, let's do something fun. And jogging, I mean, there might be some people out there who like jogging, but to me, that's never been fun. That's not fun whatsoever. That's just work.
Oh, totally. I mean, my husband likes to go. In fact, he went this morning, and, it's just like, kind of like, oh, I wish I did, because it would be fun to go with you. But no, I just don't enjoy that. I mean, we go for walks together, and that's awesome. But yeah, it's like, no. But yeah, I mean, literally and figuratively seemed like a punishment. I mean, I felt like I was being forced to do this because my body was wrong. I mean, even at that age.
Yeah, you picked up on that messaging, which I feel like kids so young pick up on that. Like, I've heard little kids be like, I won't name names, although I might have said it on the podcast before, but like a kid in my extended family who at like 2 years old, we were at this long family dining table, like outdoors eating with the family. And this kid gets up from the table and starts running around this entire big table. And people are like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm exercising to be healthy at 2 years old.
Oh my
It's
gosh.
Oh dear. Oh no, this is how it starts.
Yeah, it's like, no, at 2, you run around because you're playing and you're full
Right.
of all kinds of energy that as adults, we wish we could put in a
Right.
bottle.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I could use some of that. But yeah, that like explanation of it, that's like, I'm exercising to be healthy. It's like, oh, who told you that? Like, just, yeah, run around for fun. You don't need this explanation on it. You don't need this reasoning.
Yeah, or they picked it up from adults, even if not explicitly told. They probably heard some adult, oh, well, this is why I go running.
Right. Yeah. And that's just like, oh, like it's seemingly innocent now, but that can so easily slip into like, have to run to work off your food or all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, and it's a shame because physical activity can be such a joy, but when it's turned into a punishment, and it's just funny. Well, no, it's not funny. It's kind of sad, but just thinking about my relationship with my body, even at that age, now that I'm kind of slowly working my way through some of the work by Neva Paran on embodiment, and just, at that age, it was just this huge Bermuda Triangle of things. My dad made fun of me because I was klutzy. I got messages that my body was wrong. I was forced to do some types of activity that I didn't want to do. And I just was not at home in my body. I remember my mom taking me to jazzercise classes. This was, the late 70s, early 80s. And even though I kind of liked it, because it was dancing, it was kind of fun. That was the era when everyone was wearing tights and leotards, which are just, awful. But
yeah.
I remember I wanted to hide in the back row because I didn't want anyone to see me. I did not want to be seen. And it's just like, wow, the more I learn about embodiment, it's just like, oh, I was so disembodied at such a young age.
And that's what it does, right? That diet culture messaging makes us disembodied. It's like takes us out of our bodies and into this realm of what does my body look like? How are other people perceiving my body? And that's really patriarchy too, like making us have that external gaze on ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I remember, in high school, this was after my parents' divorce, and I was living with my dad because I didn't want to move. I didn't want to change high schools. But, I'd be laying on the floor watching TV in the evening. And if he was sitting in the same room and I had to get up to go, I don't know, use the restroom or whatever, I didn't want to get up because I didn't want him to look at me and judge me. And he was, he was very judgmental. There's probably one of the memories that kind of sent me to spend a fair amount of time and money in therapy this would have been fifth or sixth grade. I just know this because of the house we lived in, but I think it was the weekend and he and my mom were outside doing yard work or something. And I was a very introverted, bookwormish kid. So I was sitting inside. It was summer probably, but I was sitting inside reading a book. And my dad came in and just started yelling at me. He told me I was fat and lazy. And I remember running outside, practically cowering by the side of the house, just wanting the ground to open up and swallow me. And that was probably the harshest thing he's ever said. But, those things, they stick. They stick.
Oh, yeah. And that the fact that he was judging you in that way and that it came out in that sort of big moment, but you picked up on that judgment, it sounds like, all along the way in those subtler moments too, because, like that belief system was there in him. He saw things that way and you could tell.
And the irony is, looking back at pictures of myself, when I was growing up, objectively, you could say I was a little quote unquote overweight, but it was nothing. It's just like, wow. It's like the messages I got. Well, not only were the messages I got not justified, no matter what I may have weighed, because we know the impact of that, but it's just like, really?
I feel like that's such a common theme. I've heard that from so many folks on the podcast and so many clients too, that while they may be like happily fat in their adulthood and embrace that term and embrace that identity now, they look back at photos of themselves when they were kids and say, oh my God, people were calling me fat, and that just was not objectively true. It's just a weird thing to try to reconcile, that people are putting that identity on a kid, and then you sort of take that on and try to outrun it through dieting and instrumental exercise and all the rest. And it wasn't even a true identity in the first place.
Exactly. And then the irony is if that leads to the dieting path and chronic dieting, yo-yo dieting, it's like we know that can ultimately lead to weight gain. So it's just like, it's like you're kind of, the people who say these things to kids are almost bringing about the very thing that they're criticizing, even though it wasn't really an issue maybe at the time they're criticizing it. It's warped.
Yeah, that's so true. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And again, not that there's anything wrong with being in a larger body or that weight gain is bad, but like they think it's bad and they're saying that you should try to shrink it, and they're doing the exact opposite of what they are trying to do.
Totally. Yeah. And if the weight gain comes about because of dieting, which itself does harm, and if that weight gain wouldn't have happened, yes, you're right. Weight gain, it is what it is. But when it's kind of brought about artificially because of these really verbal abuse.
And that's the real problem, is the verbal abuse and the weight cycling that, has all these health implications, and the weight stigma that has all these health implications, right? Like,
yes,
that's the real problem.
Mm-hmm. And it's funny, as controlling as my father was, it's like he would also send these mixed messages. On the one hand, I remember growing up, he would sometimes criticize how much I was eating at meals. Whereas it was interesting because my mom, I think she saw it for what it was. Kids, as they're growing, sometimes they're eating more and sometimes they're eating less, especially if they're about to go through a growth spurt. I think I even overheard her arguing with my dad one time. It's just like, okay, she's not eating too much. She's just growing. But then there'd be times where there were things they would serve that I hated, like, I hated fish growing up. I love it now, but I hated it growing up. If I knew my mom was serving fish for dinner, I'd be filled with dread because my father would force me to sit at the table until I ate. He wouldn't make me finish it, but I had to eat. And I hated it. It's like, if fish tastes fishy to you, that is just, yeah. So it's like, okay, on the one hand, I'm eating too much, but on the other hand, when I don't want to eat something, you're forcing me to eat it. It's like, what kind of messages does that send about, talk about knocking the internal intuitive eater out of someone?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You were getting it from all sides. It's like, you can't win. Oh, that's so sad. It sounds like, did he have his own issues with his body and food, or where do you think that was coming from?
I don't think he had issues with food and body. I know he had some other types of issues in his own childhood. So that might have just dealt with, it might have been more a control thing. I don't really know. It's not something I've ever really been able to have a conversation with him about. But yeah, in spite of all that, it's funny. I just remember growing up and doing things like pouring through the diets that were in my mom's magazines and thinking, if I could go on one of these, everything would be perfect in my life. But, I'm in like grade school and I'm not responsible for my own food intake. So, it's not like I could be like, Mom, can you get me the things on this diet plan? So it's like I fantasized about dieting, but I think my first actual pseudo attempt at a diet, and this is just sad. This is sad. I actually was kind of laughing thinking about it, even though there's so much that's sad about it. My parents had divorced, and my mom, the guy that was going to be my future and now former stepfather, but he was selling these meal replacement pellets, for lack of a better word. I want you to envision this. They were about these hard chocolate flavored pellets about the diameter of a quarter and about an inch thick.
Oh,
Well, I think, that Slim Fast and all that stuff. Well, I think it's still around, but it was. I think it was a version of that. And talk about patriarchy. He decided that I should, go on this meal replacement. So imagine me in high school, my freshman year of high school, sitting with my friends at lunch with my baggie of pellets.
oh God.
They were so awful. I couldn't eat them. So I scrounged together money. And what did I end up doing? Going to, 7-Eleven for like a big gulp and probably Doritos or something, which, so like, yeah, really, really worked out well. So that was my first. But even then I had the magical belief that, oh my gosh, this might be the ticket to a perfect life. But it was just like, they were so nasty. I couldn't even eat them.
Oh, that's so terrible. And just, the fact that he would decide to put you on that and that you didn't have a say. Oh.
Yeah. And my mom just kind of went along with it. I don't think she encouraged it, but she also didn't stop it, which she totally, she probably should have. But yeah, it wasn't until I made it through till I was 16 years old. I was a junior in high school when I was living with my dad at that time, and he decided I should go to Weight Watchers. So he sent me to Weight Watchers.
Oh, God. What was that like?
It was, again, I'd had the fantasy for so long about dieting being a solution for, not just being smaller, but being happier. So I think I just probably went along with it. I mean, at the time, I didn't see how twisted it was that he would do this. I didn't have that perception. I felt like something was wrong with my body and he was sending me here. And if it would fix what was wrong with my body, then that was maybe going to be okay. And I think, like a lot of people, the first time they attempt dieting, I did lose weight fairly easily. And I was, I got a lot of compliments from people, and that's one of the things that kind of keeps you going. And I probably got a little more attention from guys, but from boys, but I did before. So, that wasn't so much. But I think one thing that really struck me is, I don't know how long I'd been going to Weight Watchers, but I got called into the school counselor's office one day. And my English teacher, very nice man, he noticed I was losing weight and he was worried I was developing an eating disorder. And so he wanted the counselor to talk to me. And I remember, I remember at one hand feeling pride, like, oh, my weight loss is noticeable. But on the other hand, thinking, wow, I don't have an eating disorder, because I didn't. But thinking, that's actually cool that he said something, because if I was developing an eating disorder, it would be good for someone to notice that and do something. And this would have been the mid to late 80s. So actually I was kind of amazed that at that time, especially a male teacher, that would even be on his radar. I thought was actually pretty amazing.
That's pretty rare. I mean, even in this day and age, it's rare. But back then, eating disorders were so not understood, really.
Right. And so I don't know. I have no idea. Maybe he had somebody in his own family or own life who had one. And so he just had an understanding that your average teacher might not. But I remember when I told my dad about that, and he was just pissed. I'm not sure why. I don't know if he felt like that was a judgment, on his decision to send me to Weight Watchers. I have no idea, but I just remember, he was mad.
That's interesting. Yeah, it probably felt a little like a judgment, like, you shouldn't be doing this to your kid or something.
Yeah, yeah. My experience of Weight Watchers, it was what it was. It wasn't great. I didn't feel particularly traumatized by it itself, but what it did do is it set me down the path of chronic yo-yo dieting for decades. So that is not a good thing. And that's, exactly the types of things that I'm concerned about today. And I know you're concerned about, and a lot of dietitians that understand weight science and health at every size are worried about, is that it's the catalyst.
Yeah, because that, like you said, the first time, the first diet is like the dragon you end up chasing forever, because the weight does come off easily that first time. Your body's not used to it. It's like, everything's fine. And then, you're in a famine and it loses weight accordingly. But then it gets wise, right? That weight gets harder and harder to lose as time goes on. It comes back, of course, as it does in 95 to 98% or close to 100% really of people. It comes back, and then it is harder and harder to lose again. And so you're constantly chronically dieting because you're chasing that same ease and, seeming effortlessness of weight loss that happened the first time.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. All through college, I yo-yoed, I wouldn't say huge variations, but I was definitely chasing that weight I had gotten down to during my first diet. And my high school into college boyfriend, he had fantasies of being a bodybuilder. So he had his own body image concerns. With him, it was the opposite. He couldn't get certain body parts big enough. It's just kind of interesting how these things play out differently, but it's still based on body mistrust or body dislike, body hatred.
Yeah, and these unrealistic standards of what bodies, quote unquote, should look like too.
Yeah. And something I think about often is one thing I feel very fortunate about is apparently I am not predisposed to developing an eating disorder, because I see points in my life where, oh man, if I was, that would have so triggered it. Certainly my dad's commentary, my would-be bodybuilder boyfriend, who's now a lawyer, but he was somewhat critical when I was weight cycling in college, when we were still going out. He would say things. I mean, he wasn't nearly as critical as my father, but certainly that could have been a catalyst. And I think the biggest thing, and this was the thing that started what I would call my biggest, most serious weight loss attempt, to the point where I called it a body project. 2006, I broke my ankle like really spectacularly, because, if you're going to break a bone, you might as well really do it right. So the orthopedic surgeon who was on call at the hospital was a sports medicine guy. And I remember my first post-operative appointment, I had a cast on, my ankle was like full of hardware. And he's like, well, during your recovery, you're going to gain weight and lose fitness.
Oh, no.
I mean, I tell you, and it's like the losing fitness part. It's like, okay, duh. I mean, I was like the worst klutz on crutches ever. I could barely move. So, okay, yeah, losing fitness. Okay, sure. But the irony is, right before I broke my ankle, I was gearing up to start a new diet. And then I think the two big things that hit me when I broke my ankle, and I had never broken a bone before, was one, like, oh my God, I broke a bone. I mean, that was very traumatic, but this is going to get in the way of me trying to lose weight. Like that's the most important thing. So when he said that, I remember my reaction, my mental reaction, I didn't say this to him, was kind of like, oh yeah, I'll show you. So yeah, once I was healed, I mean, it just started, it was crazy. I ramped up my exercise just extremely. I'm not going to talk about numbers or how much, but I kind of feel lucky that I think I really could have injured myself if I was into things like running or high impact sports. So that wasn't an issue for me, but it was the time involved, the time I spent. Yeah. And I did one of those online challenges where you post before and after photos of yourself in a bikini. And I was tracking macros and just the mental energy. So the irony is I did lose weight. And I was so proud of myself. I thought I had cracked the code on how to lose weight and keep it off. And that led to two things. One, I decided I wanted to go back to school to become a dietitian so I could help other people lose weight.
Classic.
And as a point of pride, I joined the National Weight Control Registry. I was so proud to do that.
Yes, I had lost the weight and kept it off, right?
That's right. It can be done. The naysayers are wrong.
Right.
I was so full of myself.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and that's why the National Weight Control Registry was started in the first place. I was researching the history of it for my book and seeing that it was basically started by two researchers who had a really vested interest in diet culture, who were very, quote unquote, anti-obesity, and who were like dismayed and disheartened by the 30 years of research at that point showing that people couldn't lose weight and keep it off long term. And we're like, we're going to go looking for some success stories and like optimistic results to prove that weight loss is possible. So they started this registry, which then people like you who are also like, yeah, it's possible, just fed right into, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I was so excited to join. I can't even tell you. Oh, the delusion.
What did that entail, joining the registry?
I don't remember the exact details. I mean, I know you had to fill out something and you had to have lost and kept off, I think, at least pounds for, gosh, was it a year? I think it wasn't that long. And so, you filled out an initial questionnaire, and then each year I would get another questionnaire in the mail. And now I believe it's all online, but at that time it was in the mail. And, I think the first year I filled it out, great, no problem. But ironically, then probably by the next one, I was already in grad school. I was already starting to study dietetics, and I didn't have as much time to weight suppress, to do the amount of exercise I needed to do, to pay as much attention to my food. I was still exercising. I was still eating healthfully, but I just didn't have that intense focus. I was going to grad school and working full time, which I telecommuted, so I couldn't have worked full time in grad school if I had to be someplace 9 to 5. But I remember that next questionnaire, I really started looking at it, and I was already starting to weight cycle again at that point. And I was cycling, so my weight was starting to trend up, but it was close. And I remember looking at the questions and thinking, the questions they're asking me are in no way capturing the fact that I'm yo-yoing. And that started to bother me because I'm like, you're gathering this information for scientific research purposes, and you're not even capturing what I felt like at that time, and I really feel like now, was important information. And then also just the questions, the food frequency questionnaires, which, I know this is a problem with any kind of nutrition research that relies on these type of questionnaires, but they would ask things like, in an average week, how much of like this huge list of foods do you eat? And I remember looking specifically at peaches, and I'm like, I only eat peaches when they're in season, which is for a relatively short span of the year. So I literally was like, okay, when peaches are in season, about how many peaches a week do I eat? Okay, so that's about X number of peaches a year. Okay, divided by 52 weeks. I mean, it was just like, I was like, this is nuts. So I think I continued. I think I filled out that one. And then the next year I was starting to regain more seriously. And even though I think I had still maintained enough to be in it, I could not admit to them that I was gaining. So I just didn't send it in. And even the previous one, I remember I lied about what my current weight was, not by a ton, but so I'm like, if I did that, how many other people are lying because of the shame? And it was shame.
Yes. And if you're signed up to this thing because you're feeling so proud of yourself and wanting, I remember I talked to Glennis Oyston several years ago about her experience on the National Weight Control Registry. And she was like, for all my troubles and starvation and hunger, I got this prize of like being on the registry. And that was, it sort of feels like validating. So if you have this sense of validation that's kind of getting ripped away or threatened to be ripped away by your weight gain, like, of course you're going to want to hang on to that. Of course you're going to be like, no, I still have it. Like, this is still worth it.
Yeah. And at that point, I I was still immersed in diet culture, and I just kind of felt like, well, eventually I'll re-lose the weight I'd gained, but right now I just can't. And I felt like a failure. And I just stopped participating. And of course, they don't ask you why. They don't follow up on any of that. So they don't know why people drop out when they drop out.
And so, yeah, you're probably still counted somewhere in there as a member of the registry.
Yeah. I'm not clear on that. I don't know if after a certain point, like 10 years or something, they just kind of lump people off. I am not actually crystal clear on that. But yeah, the pride. I mean, I remember some of my nutrition classes, my nutrition and metabolism class when we were talking about obesity. And of course, it was a very, weight-centric curriculum, that yes, obesity, quote unquote, obesity is a problem. And, but that a lot of people regain weight. And I was like, I've kept off weight. I was seriously in class. I was like, I was so proud. Like, I'm one of the outliers. Only I'm not, as it turns out. So
Yeah.
At the time, I thought I was.
Well, it's interesting, too, the way that the criteria are. It can change whether someone appears to be an outlier or not, because the National Weight Control Registry only requires people to have lost weight and kept it off for a year or more, which is ridiculous because there's evidence showing that the weight trajectory for anyone with intentional weight loss is usually weight reaches its lowest point, on average, weight reaches its lowest point around the 6-month mark. And then people start regaining it about a year, and the rate of weight regain speeds up over time. So like cutting it off at a year is actually really smart if they want to show quote unquote success for more people and have it be a higher quote unquote success rate. And actually I was looking into recently the statistics on diet failure because, there's this 95% or more statistic that gets thrown around a lot that's from a 1959 study that's actually a really well-designed study. I read this, I bought the study and read it, and it was very well done. It got some awards at the time for being a really great piece of research. And then a lot of people referenced that over the years and also did their own follow-up sort of different research confirming that it's like north of 90% at least, if not, 95+%. But that research kind of stopped in like the 2000s, right around the time when the quote unquote obesity epidemic became a thing. And I speculate that the reason people stopped doing research confirming that diets fail so frequently is that suddenly this idea of an obesity epidemic took over the research field, because the people that were doing that research showing the astronomical rates of diet failure were themselves quote unquote obesity experts. They were interested in shrinking people's bodies. They were part of diet culture. And they were just looking at like, why are we failing so often? Like it was in order to try to further their own efforts to shrink people's bodies. Like maybe we can learn something from this. Maybe we can find something that does actually quote unquote work. But then the so-called obesity epidemic was invented. And I think that world of quote unquote obesity research got really taken over by this idea that like, it's a public health crisis and we shouldn't be spending our time worrying about what fails. We should be looking at what quote unquote works. And so suddenly the emphasis shifted. But actually a 2015 study recently like replicated the same results, showing like 90 up to 98% of people who lose weight can't keep it off for 5 years or more. At the 5-year point, they're back to where they started or higher. So it's really fascinating to think about the way that research, where they cut off. And because that 2015 study too looked at like, okay, after 2 years, where are people? And it was like 50% of the people who had lost, and not everybody in the research could even lose a significant amount of weight at all, like whatever they considered the threshold of significance, which was actually very low percentage, like the lowest possible percentage to be considered significant weight loss. Very few people in that study could even achieve that amount of weight loss. And then of those people who did, how many of them regained it at like the 2-year mark and the 5-year mark? And it was like of that tiny fraction of people who were able to achieve it, 50% of them had regained it all within the 2-year mark. And then 75% of those regained it all at 5 years. And so in total of the percentage of all the people they studied, only 2 to 5% actually lost a significant amount of weight at any point during the study and kept it off for 5 years or more, which is like so wild. So when you think about all the weight loss studies that are out there that are like, we followed people up for a year, we followed people for 2 years, we followed people for 3 years, it's like you're just capturing sort of a moment in time of people's weight regain trajectory that's going to continue after the study is over.
I think there's a research paper. Gosh, I have so many papers I pull and put in my to read folder. I haven't read yet, but I think there was one kind of calling for a moratorium on these weight loss research studies that cap off at like 6 months or a year, because it's like you're not contributing anything to the body of research. This isn't long enough to see what happens. And it's like, just stop. What are you doing? And, I think kind of tangent to that, I know I've seen a few criticisms of that 1959 study, kind of along the lines of, well, that doesn't really have any bearing, with what we know today. And I'm like, really? Has human physiology changed?
Yeah.
It's like, hello. I think, things like the Minnesota starvation experiment still have extreme relevance today. Thank you very much.
I know. And that's from the 1940s. Like, it's...
Yeah. I'm finally reading Tracy Mann's The Eating Lab, and she talks about the Minnesota experiment in there. And like every time I read about it again, it's just like, oh God, we have not evolved since then.
I know. And I feel like research is so siloed because like the Minnesota starvation experiment was done in an effort to help with like World War II refeeding, giving food aid to war-torn countries and helping people recover from the famine that they had endured during the war. But like that didn't get translated to quote unquote obesity research. And, even Ansel Keys, the guy who conducted that study, went on to do a bunch of other like super diet culture-y studies and contributed a lot to the idea of good and bad food, that were there, quote, good and bad and foods that people should or shouldn't eat. And seemingly didn't understand the connection there, that we were prescribing this starvation that he had done significant research on in the 40s to people that are trying to lose weight. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. And the siloing continues today. I gave a webinar recently on weight stigma. And when I was as part of it, I was talking about the problems with obesity research. And, there's people who, there's the quote unquote obesity researchers, and then there's the weight stigma researchers, and they really don't cross too much. And that's really unfortunate because we have all this wonderful research about the impacts of weight stigma above and beyond body weight, even regardless of BMI, because weight stigma can affect anybody at any weight. But it's like there's this, and then there's people over here like, okay, let's see like how much weight people lose doing this. It's like, and they don't use weight stigma as a confounder.
Right.
I mean, it's just, okay, we need some integration. I mean, so yeah, siloing, it was an issue then, it's an issue now. The reasons why it's an issue seem to shift slightly, but
yeah, but it is this ongoing issue, totally. And it is interesting how people will dismiss that 1959 study being like, well, it's from 1959, so how much? And it's like, no, but actually we had like people followed that up over the subsequent decades for a good 30 years after that and found materially the same results. It's not just one outlier study, it's the norm. And the fact that that people are still fighting that. And like someone in my Twitter mentions today, some total asshole was just like, your degree is worthless. Like that 90 whatever percent statistic is bunk, and, show your sources. Oh, wait, you can't. And I'm like, who the fuck are you, eh? Like, what?
Oh, I know. I love social media so much for so many reasons and for the community. But then there's times where it's just like, oh, if there weren't these other reasons, I would so like end my accounts. Same.
I think about it every day. Every time I log on, I'm like, ugh, do I really want to be here? But like, yeah, it's such a mixed bag. It's like a giant, terrible town square where there's just ranting people coming at you from all sides, but then also your friends are there. So what are you going to do?
Exactly. And I think, a lot of the critics, and I think this comes from people who have nothing to do professionally with the nutrition world, but I think even within nutrition and dietetics, I think it's the people who aren't working one-on-one with people who have struggled with weight loss and chronic dieting, and they're not seeing that. I mean, I think for me, that's what made it real. Even as I kind of started to learn about HAES and intuitive eating, fortunately, while I was in grad school, I had one instructor who brought those ideas up. But, it really didn't sink in until I started working with people. And, it's like, oh, my struggles aren't unique. It's like you can't deny the traumas of just these repeated attempts to diet and weight suppress.
What was your experience like having that in school, learning about that, but also sort of just coming out of your own attempts at weight suppression? Like, where did your own relationship with your body and food start to turn?
That's interesting. Yeah, it was a very twisty path, as these things often are. It was funny. Thanks to the magic of record keeping on Amazon, I know that I purchased the book Health at Every Size, probably the end of my first trimester of grad school. And I remember reading it and thinking, this is awesome. This is awesome that people don't have to lose weight to be healthy. The message totally resonated with me, but for other people, not for me. And I know, and at that point, I felt like, well, that's cool. People don't have to lose weight to be healthy, but if they want to for like appearance reasons, like that's okay. I think the part that didn't sink in at the time was just some of the inherent harms of intentional pursuit of weight loss. But as kind of things went on, I started to realize, a few things. I started to kind of realize that, okay, if you didn't need to lose weight to be healthy, if health was not synonymous with weight, then I started to think about what was I doing? Why did I still want to diet? Because at that time, I still sort of did. And then I realized, okay, it's for appearance sakes. I acknowledge that I'm not trying to lose weight for health. I'm trying to do it to meet the social norms of the thin ideal. And then it evolved even further to, if I was to do the things take the actions on a day-to-day basis to try to weight suppress, that is not consistent with the type of life I want to live. So that's where kind of my path led me to ultimately give up dieting. And then, it's interesting. And in working with people, I kind of, when I got out of school, like a lot of dietitians who come to Hayes, I was a fence straddler for a long time.
Same.
Yeah. I felt like if people wanted to lose weight, I would help them, but I would try to help them do it in a quote healthy way.
Right.
And so, it kind of started that way, and I could see it evolve. Like eventually I started becoming less and less comfortable with the idea of helping people pursue weight loss. But if they still really wanted to, I would try to shift the focus to focusing on health, which is still, that kind of goes along with the whole quote unquote lifestyle changes and wellness. So I would try to do that. And eventually I started to come more on board with Hayes. I became a certified intuitive eating counselor, but I was working actually in weight management. It was a quote unquote non-diet approach, which, I now know is kind of counterintuitive, very counterintuitive. But patients would come to me and I would try to introduce as much intuitive eating, mindful eating, health at every size as I felt the patient was willing to accept. And when I would occasionally have a patient, like there was one patient I'm thinking of, she came to me, just horrible history of chronic dieting, which she hit a roadblock when she just really injured herself in like doing these intense boot camp fitness classes. And she came to me hoping I would help her lose weight, assuming that was what she was supposed to do. And I started talking to her about intuitive eating and health at every size, and her eyes lit up. It was like she had no idea there was another way. No idea. And those were the patients that made my day. And then I would still have the ones who they'd be sleeping better, feeling better. Maybe their acid reflux had cleared up, but they weren't losing any weight. And so they felt like my work with them had no value.
So frustrating. I've had that experience too, where it's like, you sort of bargain with them to say like, okay, let's put weight loss on the back burner and talk about the other things you really want or what you think weight loss is going to bring you, and then try to target those things specifically instead of using weight loss as like this middleman to try to get the things you want. And then you help them get the things that they want, that they were after, but it feels like a hollow victory for them, or like it doesn't really matter because they haven't lost weight. It's so frustrating.
Yeah. And I feel like you do what you can. And, and I really believe in meeting people where they're at. But, I also, one thing, fortunately, I never did as a professional dietitian, I never promised that weight loss was possible. I never promised. And, I feel like at least there was that.
Yeah, that's huge.
but it's hard. And I sympathize because I was immersed in diet culture myself. And so I know what it's like. And I mean, it's hard. Everyone's walking their own path. And I feel like if I can help them find a better path, or, maybe they would eventually head to the path of, not pursuing weight loss, and I can help them get there sooner. But I do, I feel fortunately that I had that one catalyst when I was in grad school, an instructor who went on to be one of my preceptors in my internship and my mentor, and we're friends today, who just introduced those ideas.
That's amazing and so rare for dietitians. I mean, you wrote a piece recently about weight stigma and dietetics education and how hard it is to find health at every size resources as a dietitian, or that what people are being taught is inherently weight stigmatizing to the future clinicians too, to the RDs to be. And so, yeah, it's really kind of miraculous that you were able to find, or just kind of stumbled into someone who was health at every size and introduced you to that concept.
Yeah, because if it wasn't for her, I mean, my program was great, but I think I got my master's in public health, and I know what that can be like. Anything with a public health orientation, the war on obesity and the obesity epidemic. And I feel like, the two, I mean, my education overall was great, in spite of general weight centrism. But I feel like, this one professor that introduced these ideas, but also in my public health classes, they introduced the ideas of social determinants of health, which really was like, what?
Yeah.
So that stuck with me. So in spite of of course, my public health classes, they're also talking about the quote unquote war on obesity, but it's like, okay, at least they had this other part that really stuck with me and kind of led me to think about these things in a different way than, what we're encouraged to think about professionally and culturally.
I know that's such a saving grace, I think, of a lot of public health programs. I don't know if every public health program has that focus or has a class on that, but I remember taking that class, and I was in the public health nutrition concentration, which is basically the quote unquote war on obesity concentration. Like everything else in that concentration was about, like the obesogenic environment, quote unquote, and like blah, 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 just so much stuff that I now seriously question, but at the time was like so bought in. But then I took this social determinants of health class, and it really it didn't like fully blow my mind, because I don't think I was fully considering the implication, like all of the implications of it. But it did have this sort of record scratch moment of like, really? Like what? Just sort of like slightly considered it in the context of everything else I was learning, and then was like, okay, moving on. Like I didn't quite fully get it, but it did plant a seed. And then years later, when I was starting to get immersed in health at every size, that knowledge kind of came back to me, and I was like, okay, so that also plugs in, and this is part of this larger kind of social justice understanding of people's relationships with their bodies that I can now sort of advocate for. So it was lucky that was there, because it kind of saved the whole program from just being like one big weight stigma fest.
Mm-hmm. But I think you're right. The planting the seeds, and that's a metaphor I use all the time. And, I've certainly seen that in my own life. And I feel like with my patients, the ones who aren't kind of ready to give it up, it's like, I can plant the seeds. Or, when I write an article talking about weight stigma, there's going to be people like, you don't know what you're talking about. But you know what? Maybe I planted a seed, and who knows, at some point.
Yes. And I think back to myself when I first heard about health at every size, before I was even specializing in eating disorders, when I was still in the like quote unquote food environment, food policy space, and was just like, no, this is not, like health at every what? That's not possible. Like fought the friend of mine fellow journalist who was introducing me to those concepts. I like argued with him and debated, and had to edit a piece of his, and I changed so many things, and we went back and forth about what to include and what not to include and stuff. But at the time I was just like, no, I'm right and you're wrong. But then again, 10 years later, I'm like, oh no, he was totally right. Like it's just, it planted the seed. It helped it kind of start percolating in the back of my mind. So I get why people are so entrenched and so against it. And I've even seen too, like people in our anti-diet space online who are like initially really resistant to it come around too and become really fierce advocates for it. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah. When you know better, you do better.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's really exciting though. My former program at University of Washington, just how much has changed. And I finished my thesis. It was December of 2013. So I haven't been at RD for too long, but just what's changed. This same instructor who teaches the nutrition counseling class there, I think every year she brings in Erin Harrop, who has, to talk. And I know when I was talking to the coordinator of that graduated program there for my weight bias and dietetics education article, I mean, she told me that the students who weren't able to attend FNCE, they heard about your debate and they asked if they could listen to the recording of it.
That's awesome.
So they knew, and that's why it's just like it's in the water. I mean, they knew it had happened and they wanted to hear it. And so there's, I think, exciting things are happening.
Really exciting. That's so cool. I didn't know that about the debate. That's really, really nice to hear. And I mean, I was just telling you offline, like, I feel like every time I go to an event like that where I'm speaking to people afterwards and, having people come up and ask questions and stuff, the people who are so on board with HAES are like the RDs to be and the dietetic interns. And like, that's really exciting because I feel like that is the future, like those folks are the future. And if they are already steeped in HAES and looking for ways to bring HAES into even their work as dietetic interns and sort of looking at like, how can I reduce the harm that I do even when I'm like having to do some BS weight management rotation or whatever, that really bodes well for the future of our field, I think.
Yeah. And maybe it's because these ideas are starting to kind of come out more and kind of be in the water. I feel like, the students who are just starting dietetics programs, I mean, they have just as good of odds of being immersed in diet culture personally, but they haven't gone through it yet, in their education yet. So I think the more that HAES-focused dietitians are spreading the word and people are picking up on it at a kind of a formative time.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think that's the key. And also I think like the idea of, that so many dietitians have had our own struggles with food in our bodies too. Like you and I have both shared, and so many people on the podcast have shared, and our colleagues, like that oftentimes what brings us to this field is our own either struggles with food and weight or like quote unquote successes where we think, we can tell other people what to do, but it's because we've struggled and had a lot of pain around it and been chronic dieters and, bought into diet culture, which ultimately I think a lot of dietitians wake up to or sort of recognize in ourselves like, oh crap, I'm struggling with this. How am I supposed to tell other people what to do when I'm secretly binging or I'm, having these disordered behaviors behind the scenes while trying to be like the perfect dietetic student eating like the perfect way. And I think when people have that self-awareness and the more of us that are talking about it, the more it sort of gets out there into the field and that people in their education can recognize like, oh, that's me too. Like I came to this because I have issues with food and let me try to work on healing my issues with food so that I don't pass them down to my clients.
Yeah. And it's so hard. I just feel like there's so much, I think, shame about that. I mean, I feel like anybody who struggles, anybody with personal struggles around food and body, there's a lot of shame. And then coming into that as a nutrition dietetics professional, if you feel like it's like, do as I say, not as I'm doing. Mm-hmm. And then also just, as there's the HAES awakening and the fence straddling, I mean, I felt so much shame about sort of doing pseudo weight management, even as I was, I was learning that this is not the path. And I was so relieved just hearing, from you and from other dietitians who were open about how, they had their time where they were fence straddling too. And I'm just like, okay, it's not just me and I will work my way out of this. And now I'm in a place where I don't have to fence straddle anymore. So that is a good thing.
Yeah. And I think that's so true that we all go through it. And for the most part, I feel like everybody has to fence straddle as a part of their developmental process with this stuff because we get educated in such a weight normative framework and we have to work in such weight normative placements, in our internships or take whatever job comes our way at first, we don't necessarily have a huge say in like who hires us or where we end up. So it's the fence straddling is maybe sort of part of the process. I mean, I would love it if there would be a day that, and I am working towards that, and I know you are too, and I'm hoping that one day that doesn't have to be the case and that we're all just on the haze side of the fence from the beginning and there's no fence anymore to have to get over. It's just all haze. But for now, I think it's, there's going to be a fence and there's going to have to be a way of getting over it. And you can't really just, I don't know, teleport over it. So we're probably going to have to straddle it for a little bit. Everyone's going to.
Yeah. And it's hard. I think that's where self-compassion comes in.
Mm-hmm.
It helps.
It really does. It really does. Yeah. Have you found that to be a healing part of your own relationship with food and your body as well, the self-compassion piece?
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I mean, what's the alternative? It's like clearly, beating up on myself didn't help. And I think it's just interesting just how self-compassion ties in with being immersed now in the haze world. I mean, just all these beautiful parts, the self-compassion plays into it, the acceptance, especially when you get into the social justice aspects of haze and the common humanity, which is a core concept of self-compassion. I mean, if you're beating up on yourself, you're putting up a wall, you're saying you're different from other people. It all flows in together.
Totally. And actually, the weight stigma piece, I think, really comes into play there too, because we know that weight stigma has these incredibly high health risks and puts our well-being in jeopardy in so many ways, physical and mental. And really, I think the antidote to stigma and discrimination is compassion and understanding, like in general. And if we can have compassion for ourselves, for the struggles that we go through with food and body stuff, I think that does help provide an antidote to weight stigma, but also at the societal level, developing more compassion, which, is really the more important thing. I mean, I was just attended a talk at the Academy for Eating Disorders conference with Fiona Sutherland, former podcast guest and friend of mine, friend of the show,
yes.
and Janelle Mensinger. And they were talking about how the concept of internalized weight stigma, which is becoming a thing in the research where researchers are now specifically talking about internalized weight stigma. And it does seem like, when people internalize weight stigma, it has significant effects on their mental and physical health, which makes total sense because when you take in discriminatory ideas and apply them to yourself, that's going to not be so good. That's going to be harmful. But that focus on internalized weight stigma is really threatening to eclipse, and we can't let it eclipse the idea of societal weight stigma, because that's the real problem. That's where the internalized weight stigma comes from. You can't internalize something from nowhere. It has to come from somewhere. You're taking it in from the culture when you internalize it.
Totally. I mean, and I think, weight stigma, it needs to be fought on both the personal and societal fronts. But if we limit it to the personal front, it's like, oh, it's your responsibility to cultivate your own self-compassion and your own resilience. It's like, in a way, that's no different than saying, oh, you feel like you're being discriminated about because of your weight? Well, lose weight. Mm-hmm. It's like, no, it is not. I mean, I feel like there is value in shoring up our own, resilience. And that's true for people of any body weight. For example, I was at a workshop a few months ago for professionals, dietitians, therapists, and some community activists, around body positivity. And there was a woman her body meets the thin ideal. And she acknowledged that she just lived in fear of losing that privilege. And she was self-aware, but it's like, this is somebody, it's like, wow. I mean, you would look at her walking down the street and think she doesn't have body issues. And it's like, it affects everybody potentially. I mean, maybe there's some people who have got it together and they figured it out and they're completely at home in their skin. It's like, yay. But that's the minority.
Oh, yes, definitely.
But with self-compassion, I mean, when I talk to other dietitians and educating them about weight stigma, it's just like, we need to examine our own biases and I know this as, my first career was journalism. And in journalism school, I mean, we were told everybody has biases. You need to be aware of what they are. So I talk to people, we have biases. And when you start examining your biases, that can feel real uncomfortable. And if you don't accompany that with a sense of self-compassion, you're going to shut off and not progress and not actually do the work to kind of overcome those biases so you don't end up impacting others with them.
Yeah, it's such a good point that's self-compassion is essential for that process because it is so painful. And I think that's why for societal change to happen, the personal change needs to happen too, but it's not in lieu of the societal change happening. It's like we have to do our own work so that we can feel okay in our skin and be able to like function in the world. Because as you said, dieting and the pursuit of thinness and weight suppression really takes up so much of your time and takes you away from your values in life. Whatever things you want to really put your energy toward in life, it can really curtail that if you're constantly pursuing the thin ideal. So we have to clear the way for us to be able to live in line with our values. But then also we owe it to the world, I really think, to like do the social justice thing too, of paying it forward and working to make the world a better place and taking the weight stigma away, clearing the path for other people too.
Yeah. And, again, in talking to dietitians about this, a lot of dietitians, I think, don't believe that social justice is within their scope of practice. But I'm like, we are human beings who care about our patients and clients and want them to be happy and healthy. And so social justice is absolutely within our scope of practice.
Yes. And even the word justice is in our code of ethics as dietitians too, right? It's like, it's there,
I know. It's like, hello, and do no harm and all those good things.
I know. Non-maleficence.
Which is hard to say. I always hate it when I need to say that word, in a webinar or something. It's just like, oh, it does not roll off the tongue.
No, it does not. It makes me think of, I think like the villain in like Sleeping Beauty is called Maleficent, right?
Yes.
Like, don't be like her.
Yeah, exactly. But I know. I mean, sometimes it feels like there's such a long way to go, but at the same time, I feel like there is progress.
Yeah. And I think we have to hold on to that hope in order to keep moving forward, right? That's like something that really, going back again to that sort of dynamic between or dialectic between the personal and the political. It's like, I think personally for me, having some sense of optimism and just like feeling like things are changing is important for me to be able to be a part of the collective and a part of the social justice movement, even when I look around and see like, oh shit, definitely in certain ways, things are getting worse. And for certain people and groups of people, things are getting worse. But like, I just have to believe that on the whole, we are getting somewhere. Otherwise, I'm not going to be able to go on.
Yeah. You're not going to be able to get out of bed in the morning. Yeah. Just pull the covers up.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what's even the point, And like you said, we all have biases and perspectives on the world. And so I could easily change my perspective to be like, everything sucks. Why should I try? But like, that's just one perspective. That's one bias. And I'm choosing not to have that one because it's not going to serve me or the world to have that.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, looking at just the connections between personal and societal, it's just like, every day I look at how far I've come, and as mired as I was in diet culture and with, everything thrown at me, kind of indoctrinating me from such a young age. And, it's not like I don't have days where diet culture kind of whispers in my ear, but it's just like, now hold on. And that's where self-compassion comes in and acceptance. It's like, yep, sometimes those thoughts are going to come across, but I don't have to act on them.
And yeah, having more compassion for yourself than that. Mm-hmm. Being like, I have too much compassion for myself to go back there. And I could, and that's a choice that's available to me always, but why would I want to? Let me look at my values. Let me look at what's really important to me and how I want to really care for myself. And there's privilege in that too, getting to a place of feeling like the more compassionate thing to do is not to pursue weight loss or not to do what diet culture says is easier for people who have more privilege in this world, whatever privileges that may be, whether it's body size privilege, because of course it's easier when you can move around the world in a societally accepted thin body, but it's also educational privilege, economic privilege, white privilege, all that stuff kind of adds to it and makes it easier to make that choice. So I get that like a lot of people who are struggling and looking for ways to cope, diet culture presents such a seductive picture of like, you can cope like this and get what you want. Like you were saying, your sort of belief about diets as a child was like, this this is the key to happiness. Like, this is the way,
Totally.
To get
Magic.
what I want. It's magic. And they do a really good job of selling us that idea. It's very insidious.
Oh, yeah. I recently wrote about celery juice, and oh my gosh, the vitriol that got hurled at me on social media. for that. I mean, people that have bought in hook, line, and sinker, and it's just like, and again, I feel compassion because I see how seductive those messages are. And yeah, and you're absolutely right about privilege. I mean, I have tremendous privilege. I have the privilege to have the time and space, even though not as much as I would like because I'm pretty busy, but to explore things like mindfulness and self-compassion and things like acceptance and commitment therapy. These things that help you, I think, cope and realize you get a thought in your head and it's a thought, it's words. You don't have to act on it. But if you're just kind of surviving day to day, you don't have that privilege to examine those things.
Right. Yeah. And it does take time and labor too. So like, if all your time and labor is going to survival, then of course, which is just another way that I think our entire system acts to exacerbate oppression and to like uphold privilege on the people that already have it and remove privilege or prevent the attainment of privilege for the people who don't already have it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to do. There's a lot of work to be done. And like
there is.
Weight stigma eradication is just kind of the first step.
Yeah. Any kind of stigma. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's all interconnected too.
Yeah, it is. It is. And intersectionality. And yeah, that's a whole other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. And it is, I mean, I think it's always intersectional. We have to always be thinking about how like weight stigma intersects with other forms of oppression. And just because, like I have tremendous privilege and yet also still suffered from disordered eating and hated my body. And both of those things can be true. You can have thin privilege, which just means you are able to move through the world without having constant oppression because of the size of your body. Like you can buy clothes in mainstream stores, you can fit into airplane seats, you don't have people insulting you as you walk down the street for no reason. All of that is thin privilege. But then also you can hate your body even when you have that.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, weight stigma affects people across the weight spectrum.
Yeah. And, and that's something I would remind my patients of a lot. I would just be like, okay, I would use Sports Illustrated magazine as an example. It's like, I guarantee you that at least a large proportion of the models that appear in the swimsuit issue have body issues. They have their agents or a photographer or someone saying, you need to lose more weight, and it's just like, it doesn't matter who it is. I mean, it could be somebody that like 99.9% of society thinks is like a pinnacle of physical perfection, and they could just have intense self-loathing. We don't know what goes through people's heads. So it's just, and I think using metaphors like that helped some people realize that no, life isn't going to be magically happy and perfect if they lose weight.
Right.
We all have problems. Mm-hmm. We all have problems.
And the folks who have that size privilege or that body privilege are terrified of losing it in a lot of cases, like you said about that woman, right? Like, yes. Because that's why it's important to treat this as a social justice issue, really, because it affects everybody. And if we don't remove the stigma from the most marginalized people, then the people with the most privilege are still going to be fearing becoming more marginalized, and like that is a fate that could befall them. And so they better toe the line. And so then it oppresses them in that way too. So really it does affect, I think, from my social justice lens, I want to say like, we should all care about the most marginalized for the sake of being good people, for the sake of humanity, because the most marginalized among us need the most help. But for people who don't have that lens on things, who are more just like, and I get, being kind of focused on your own life or whatever, and just wanting to like feel better for yourself. And for those folks, I say, the ones who have privilege, I say like, it still matters. Social justice still matters, even if you don't think of it as an end in and of itself, because you're going to be affected by other people being stigmatized too.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's funny. I've been examining my own privilege a lot more lately. And, an example is I live in a smaller town now and everyone's just like super friendly. And I was walking down the street one day with my golden retriever and people are out in their driveways or whatever. Oh, hi. And I was just like thinking, oh, people are like so nice. And then I was like, oh, or is it because I'm a white woman who looks to be at least middle class? I mean, you can't discern from appearance walking a golden retriever. What if I was not white and I was walking, I don't know, a pit bull, a Doberman? I mean, it's just like I realized, oh, I don't know. I mean, I still think people are nice here, but it's just I think we see things through our own lens, and I think shifting and realizing how might things look if I was walking around in a different body or a different skin color. How might that be different? I know a lot of people don't want to do that, but I think that's part of exploring our own biases and also just the biases that exist in the world.
Totally. And that's more important now than ever, I would say, with the way that we're so politically divided in this country and the...
Are we? I haven't noticed.
And like the terrible things that are being done in the name of, America, that like, I think we need to just, everybody needs to kind of empathize more, like take a moment to put yourself in the shoes of those more marginalized than you. Because we could really learn something.
Yeah, we certainly see every day the consequences of people who are afraid of losing their privilege.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Just open up Twitter. That's another reason I'm just like, oh, God, why am I on this platform? So it's rough. It's rough out there. But that's another reason also why I just like have to have optimism, because I mean, for the first couple weeks after the election in 2016, I just like barely could get out of bed. I felt like completely just run over by a truck. But then I sort of made the decision, I have to like marshal whatever energy I can to try to change this. And if that requires just sort of being selective about what I consume in order to bolster my own optimism again and feel like, okay, like things are going to be all right. We can do this. We can come back from this. And that again is a privilege too, because I didn't have to walk around the world every day in a body that, I mean, as a woman, yes, I certainly fear for my safety a lot of times, but otherwise, I don't fear for my safety around my skin color or my other forms of identity.
Mm-hmm. I was recently rereading Lindy West's Shrill, and she says in there, like the only people, I think it was like white male, cisgendered, straight males are the only people that could be dropped anywhere in the world other than maybe a war zone and feel at minimum safe and possibly even feel in charge. And I was like, oh, speak the truth, Lindy.
Oh, it's so good.
It's like, and
that's so true.
My husband and I have some interesting conversations about that. Just like, as a woman, it's just like,
Mm-hmm.
And, like I said, and I have the privilege of not fitting into other, marginalized and oppressed groups, but
Yeah. No, I think now is a time when people have to be like listening more to everyone's stories of oppression or feeling unsafe in the world. And like, I've had some very interesting discussions with my husband too about, because he's very woke in a lot of ways, but also just, a white male cisgender dude walking around the world. Like it's so different. So different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I could talk to you forever. And this is, I feel like, a whole other conversation over drinks that we could have or over delicious food. But tell us where people can find you and learn more about your work.
Well, my website is nutritionbycarrie.com. And on Twitter, and Instagram, I'm Carrie Dennett. And I write weekly for the Seattle Times. I write monthly for the Washington Post. And I always put links to those on my website. So
awesome. And you've been writing such amazing things about weight stigma and just really working to bring the HAES message to such a wider audience. So I'm really excited and grateful about your work and just can't wait to share it with people.
Cool. Well, it's been such a pleasure talking with you.
You too. Thank you so much. So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Carrie Dennett for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. If you've gotten some value out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, which is so many people, right? By sharing this episode on Apple Podcasts or iTunes or your favorite podcast platform. Sharing on one of the Apple platforms helps bring us up higher in the podcast rankings so that more people discover us and so that we can continue to drown out the pro-diet messages and keep rising up in the health category. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always so appreciated. And be sure you're subscribed yourself by going to christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we mentioned, plus a full transcript, you can go to christyharrison.com/194. That's christyharrison.com/194. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasek, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing the show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Meredith Noble, and our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.